Hello and welcome to the fourth, I can't believe it's the fourth one already, the fourth in Evolution Live. Few minor technical hiccups beforehand, as always, it wouldn't be a live stream without it. Welcome, and for those of you that have seen all of the three previous classes, welcome back. Thank you for joining me again. For those of you that are new here, hi, I am Dr. Sally LePage. I have a PhD in evolutionary biology, and now I am a science YouTuber. And so whilst all the schools are shut and university lessons might not be taking place as normal and everything's kind of up in the air, I am giving a roughly 1 hour class, lecture, call it what you want, about the topic of evolution within biology, so that you can start watching the course having absolutely no knowledge about evolution or biology or anything like that, and then week on week it will build up and get more complex. I won't say harder, I'll say it's more complex. For those of you that have watched the previous ones, you may notice that you can actually hear me this time, and that is because, thank you to my lovely people that have started helping out on Patreon, I managed to buy this new mic, which is very cool. Like, did I mostly choose it because it's red? Yes, but it does mean that I can do proper ASMR stuff. So hopefully the audio quality should be better on that, and that is thank you to the people that have supported me on Patreon, so thank you to you. Although all of these courses are free, it does all help. Today, what a title. Someone commented previously on the chat that it's clickbait. I mean, it's perfectly true. We are going to be looking at the selfish gene, and I can now take my headphones out. Okay, so we are going to be looking at the selfish gene, but all I have been hearing about all week is blooming, I was going to say Lion King, it's the other one, Tiger King, and I have never seen Tiger King. I say never, it's only recently been published, and I don't really know what it's about, but it's about animals and it's got an element of mystery to it. That's all I know about it. And I'll tell you now that I am so excited for this class, because we are finally, after 3 hours of kind of preliminary covering the basics, a primer in evolution, we're able to cover the stuff that I find super interesting. Like, we're finally getting onto stuff that's similar to what my PhD was in. And that is the selfish gene and gene-centered evolution. But that means that we're suddenly going to go from what were quite simple concepts to some quite big conceptual ideas. And so I thought, what way to hook you all? Because we've had a game of evolution bingo, if you remember that. That was all about DNA coding and mutations. We played a bingo game together. Last week we were playing with chocolate buttons and whether milk or white chocolate buttons would be naturally selected. This week we've got a mystery, an animal mystery, and the animal in question happens to be, obviously, tits. And when I say tits, I do, of course, mean long-tailed tits. So the mystery of the tits, I'm going to go over to the notebook. Oh, everything's so smooth, so smooth. It can only go downhill from here. And as always, I'm just gonna bring you over a bit. So for those of you that don't have the pleasure of knowing what a long-tailed tit is, this little fluff ball is a long-tailed tit. It is possibly the most adorable bird that exists. We are so lucky to get them in the UK. In fact, I get them on my feeders, which are literally there. They're maybe 2 meters away, and the long-tailed tits are the friendliest of the birds. I have been outside and they have just flown a meter away from me, and they make these little beep, 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 beep noises. They have some wonderful names in English. I know I'd say folklore, but kind of like colloquial names. Sadly, this is not my photo. It is, I do have permission to use it though. But yes, they are utterly adorable. And what's even better is because they're so small, like the body is maybe that big and the tail is about that long, so they're tiny birds. So they get cold really quickly. Maybe this is why I like them, because I get cold very quickly as well. And so in the winter, they'll all form these clans and flock together. And you can get maybe, I think someone counted, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, in the order of magnitude of about 50 of these long-tailed tits, all huddled up together in a single bird box to try and stay warm. They are adorable. So these are the tits in question that we're going to be talking about when we talk about the mystery of the tits. And because we're going to be talking about them quite a lot, I actually sent a message out on Twitter asking if someone could draw one for me. Because we all know from my previous attempt at drawing a map for the Wallace line, I'm not too good at drawing. So thank you to, let me get their names, Roland Gromes and Claude L on Twitter. We now have this. This is gonna be our little chat for the week. Oh, okay, it's, yeah. So yeah, Roland drew this and somehow is able to do this while being colourblind, so couldn't see the pink. So Claude had to explain what shade and whereabouts the pink was on the long-tailed tit to someone who was colour. It's all very impressive. I just love it. So what is the mystery of the long-tailed tits? Okay, so long-tailed tits, so they all flock together in winter, but then come spring, they all start to form monogamous pairs. So they pair up in twos, and then they start to build nests. And I have to show you what these nests look like. This is one of their nests, and they make them out of moss and lichen. They make them out of moss and lichen, and they glue it all together with cobwebs. So they go around, they pick up spiders' webs and use that as the thread to sew the moss and the lichen together. And then, as if that wasn't cozy enough, they line the nest with bird feathers that they find lying around. So cute, so cute. And so here is an example of a long-tailed tit that is bringing in a feather to line the nest there. Oh, they are the cutest. And then, just so you get an idea, if they breed successfully, this is what the babies look like. And yes, they do all line up in rows like that. Come on, isn't this phenomenal? I'm just going to label it so that new people know what we're talking about. This is the long-tailed tit. And I love them. So, what is the mystery though? Okay, so in spring, we have, they all try and make a nest. Unfortunately, as is life, a lot of them make a nest, they lay their eggs, and then unfortunately, their nests get predated. Some evil monster comes, swoops along and eats their eggs. I mean, they're not an evil monster, everyone's gotta live. And so now, at the very start of the breeding season, this pair of tits, and yes, I will be saying pair of tits, get your sniggers out now. We'll be talking about tits so much that the word, you'll just become completely acclimatized to it. That the pair of tits are like, oh no, what are we gonna do? We don't have a nest anymore. We've lost our chance to breed. And indeed, some of the pairs do go on to have another clutch, another batch of eggs, and then hopefully those ones don't get predated and go on. But a good number of them give up on their nests. The pair give up on making any more eggs, any more offspring, and instead go to another nest and start helping out at that nest. Now, remember last week when we were talking about natural selection? Natural selection is all about how there's variation between individuals. Oh yeah, I said that I'd give a recap of what we did last week, didn't I? So organisms have the capacity to produce far more offspring than there are resources to keep all of those offspring alive, which means that inevitably some of those offspring are going to die, and there's competition between which ones sorry, I just got distracted by a comment which said, you might say we're tittering. Scruffy, that is a genius joke. So there is competition between these individuals, and the individuals, because they're all slightly different from each other because of variations, some do better at this competition, some do worse, and the ones that do better pass on their winning traits to their offspring. So you get more and more of the winning traits in the population. That is natural selection, as we found out with chocolate buttons. So the mystery is, we've got these individuals that through some genetic mutation that's causing this behavioural change, their behaviour causes them to give up on their own offspring. Like, if we're talking about evolution as being you're trying to survive and reproduce, these tits have a behavioural mutation that means that they don't reproduce that year. They give up on trying to produce offspring that year and instead help some other bunch of tits to reproduce. Like, how? That doesn't make sense based on what we've covered so far. And so that is what I am calling the mystery of the tits. So when I'm talking about they're helping at another nest, they're going around, they're finding caterpillars, they're finding seeds, they're flying backwards and forwards, and they feed the little chicks in the nest, and those chicks can go from normally, with no helpers, those chicks only have a 10% survival rate. The first year survival rate of most animals is incredibly low. As you add one helper to the nest, you get a pretty much doubling. You get 20% survival rate of those chicks. And then it goes up and up the more helpers there are at the nest. So they are putting in the pair that failed to have a nest are putting in a lot of their own resources into helping some other random tits offspring. So that would be a puzzle. The next part is selection is about making genes. We talked a lot last week about you're trying to make more individuals. That is kind of true, but I kind of didn't tell you the whole truth. I told you nothing but the truth, but I didn't quite tell you the whole truth. Oh, Julia Jean's asked a good question. Oh, Julia Jean, perfect name for this class. Is it random though? There's something to think about, Julia. Are they some random tits offspring that they're helping? Very good question. So selection is all about making genes. So let me go back to the notebook. Here we are. Got my pen. So previously we talked about, let me just shrink this over. So we had the, oops, that's too far over. There we go. Natural selection. We said last week was individuals, they win, they survive, and go on to reproduce more. And we call this individual centered evolution, because unsurprisingly it's focused on the individual, so we call it individual centered evolution. And that's not wrong. But at the same time, we can reframe it. So if you remember in lesson 2, we talked about how there are mutations, and mutations can change the morphology, physiology, or behaviour of an individual. So we can also say that, and put a line under that, all organisms have genes that code for proteins. Remember we played bingo. And then these proteins affect the morphology, physiology, and behaviour. And within a population, you can get multiple forms of the same gene. And these are called alleles. If this is all sounding a bit confusing, you can go to lesson 2. All of these classes are recorded and available afterwards. So you can go back and watch that, where we talked a bit more about genes and mutations. But there are multiple variants. This is just kind of quick summary of a gene, which we call alleles. And this creates variation. Now, instead of saying that there are individuals that reproduce more, we can say, and here is the different bit, and here is where conceptually it gets quite interesting. We can say that alleles, so variants of genes, so you might have a gene for blonde hair versus brown hair colour. So the gene is for hair colour and the allele is either blonde or brown. And so alleles that result in more surviving copies of itself will eventually replace the alternative. So let's just take a moment for that. And I am aware that this lesson might be a little bit longer than the other ones because it's conceptual, so I wanted to stick it all together so that it all makes sense and all ties in. So last week we had the milk chocolate buttons and the white chocolate buttons, and just by making more copies of themselves, I think we had the milk chocolate buttons winning last week, just by making more copies, that managed to take over until we had no more white chocolate buttons left. We only had milk chocolate buttons. So if you've got two forms of a gene and one of them is able to make more copies, so let's go to blonde and brown hair. If the blonde-haired gene, the blonde-haired allele, is able to somehow make more copies of the blonde-haired allele than the brown-haired allele is able to make copies of itself, then you'll end up with a population of individuals that all contain the blonde-haired allele. Please let me know if something is completely not making sense. This is the sort of thing where it's quite difficult to do it without feedback. And so we can, And so because of that, another way of describing what natural selection is instead of saying it's when individuals are able to survive and reproduce and make more similar individuals, we can also describe it as the differential survival of alternative alleles through their effects on replication success. And because allele is a word that means variant of a gene, so what flavour gene you've got, we call this gene-centred view of evolution. So pretty much the everything is working the same as we talked about last week, where if you're able to produce more of something than someone else is able to produce, then that thing that's doing really well is producing lots of them will take over the entire population until they're the only one left. It's just now we're not talking about that being individuals producing offspring. We're talking about genes producing more genes. And obviously the way that genes replicate is by and large through sex in terms of all the interesting stuff. Like you can have asexual reproduction as well, but you have sexual reproduction where half of all of the genes in your body go into an egg or into a sperm, and then obviously in fertilization they combine, and then you get offspring which have half of the same genes as in your body. I am trying to ignore the sloth conversation just for now. Yes, I do call them sloths. And so we call that as well identical by descent. The genes inside your body are able to produce more genes by controlling your body in a way that makes more genes, by controlling your body in a way that makes more offspring. Remember in the first class, I said we'd be using the teleological argument, which is where I'm saying that the gene wants to produce more of itself, or the gene wants to control the individual. The gene is a bunch of atoms stuck together. It is a chemical, it is an acid called deoxyribonucleic acid. It has no brain, it has no agency, it doesn't want anything. It's just that, to put it bluntly, life is, and everything we know as life, is what spontaneously happens because of the laws of the universe when it's a spontaneous way in which chemicals are able to produce more chemicals. It's entirely probabilistic, there is no agency, but my God, is it easier to talk about it if there was agency. So I'm going to be talking about this as if the genes want something. So, that was point number 2. Now, we are merely vehicles. You lot are probably a lot more into your sci-fi than I am, but a lot of the time you see like these massive robots is it Men in Black maybe? And you've got these big, tall robotic machines. And then suddenly the visor lifts up from the head and you see that there's actually a tiny little thing controlling it inside with all of the little levers and things like that. That is what I want you to be thinking about with this next section. So what we've got, maybe it's a thing that happens in loads of different things. I'm thinking there's one in Labyrinth where the big monster comes out of the gates and it turns out that there's just a tiny little gremlin inside who's controlling all the levers. Or Men in Black, I suppose Daleks in a sense, are these big robots with this tiny little squidgy thing inside just controlling all the buttons. So it may be weird to think about it, but this physical, fleshy, warm, wet body, we are just the shell and we are being controlled by our genes. This is the work of this guy, who we have already had on, he's already come up in our class. It's obviously Richard Dawkins, looking rather young and dashing there. Don't know what's going on with his eyebrows. But he was the one that really verbalized this separation between the individual, the fleshy bit of us, and the genes. So, imagine you've got, I'm going, wrong pen. So imagine you've got this kind of, this is where you see how bad my drawing skills are. But in my head, I'm imagining some kind of monster like this. I don't know why they have claw hands, but they do. And they've got these big, funny robotic legs. I don't know why, but I have a very clear image in my head of what this monster looks like, and for some reason it looks like that. So here is my big evil monster, and maybe it's got like what look like big eyes. There we go. So here, yes, he did coin the term meme. That will come later on. It's in chapter, I want to say it's in chapter 13 or in chapter 17 of The Selfish Gene in 1976. He coins the term meme, which deliberately sounds like gene for a reason. So this is my little monster thing. There we go, Robbie the robot. This is Robbie the robot. But inside, when you lift up the visor, so I'm imagining this is some kind of like glass thing here. And inside is actually, I'm really bad at drawing. Inside it is Gene the Gene. How can genes have a face? There we go, our gene has a face. And so what Richard Dawkins did was to say that this, the individual, I always have to stop and say individual every time I write it, is called it's called the vehicle. And the gene is called the replicator. And so you can think, because we are, as individuals, are the product of our genes, like everything that makes us us is programmed by our genes with a bit of environment thrown in. And so in an odd way, our genes are controlling us. Like, our behaviour is controlled by the genes that control how our brain works, how we interpret information and stimuli, our strength might be in part controlled by our genes. And so whatever we do is a product of our genes, is give or take a bit of environment. Let's not get into nature nurture. We did that in a previous episode. And so genes are actually the ones doing all the stuff here. Genes are the ones that want to go on and produce more genes. But the way that they've found of producing more copies of themselves, if you imagine this tiny little helpless gene that can't actually do anything, it has to be inside this big machine in order to actually get any work done to be useful. Genes have found that if they stick together, and instead of just one gene on its own making one protein, if they all work together and create this individual, that they can use that shell, that vehicle, to produce more copies of genes, which from the individual level looks like an individual producing more offspring. And so individuals are the ones that live and die and reproduce. But genes are the ones that replicate. And they replicate by producing more individuals with that gene. Because here you've got to imagine that all blonde-haired genes are like have this hive mind. So it even though the atoms of the gene in me might not be the same as in my future offspring, it's the same code. So that's all that matters. I think you're smart enough to get that. And it's genes. So blonde-haired genes want there to be more blonde-haired genes in the world. And the way that blonde-haired genes make more blonde-haired genes in the world is to control their vehicle, their big robot, their individual that has blonde hair, to make more blonde-haired individuals. And as an effect of that, so the blonde-haired gene makes the blonde-haired individual produce more blonde-haired individuals, and each of those contains the blonde-haired gene as well. So in essence, the blonde-haired gene has controlled its robot machinery to produce more of itself. And it's the so now we can go back to the here we can see it's the differential survival of genes through their effect on replication success. So that is how are we doing for time? Okay. It's like I say, this is quite a conceptual lesson. It's a lot of stuff to get your head around. But this lesson will be available later if you want to go back and watch various bits. All of this is from The Selfish Gene, which I have recommended before on this live stream, but I cannot recommend it enough. I think I read it when I was about 16. I had a look for my copy, but I think it's in a different place. It is a really good book, and he is so good, Richard Dawkins, at explaining this conceptually. And obviously in a book, he's got a longer period of time to talk you through it. Electromorphous says, but if the robot is clever enough, they can resist the orders of their gene overlord. Well, there is a biological equivalent of that. That can sometimes happen because, of course, there's not one individual gene controlling the robot. Every gene is sat in that cockpit controlling the robot. So what happens if all of those genes sat around the table? A bit like what's that Disney Pixar film about emotions called? Where all the different emotions are sat in Riley's brain, and they all try to, oh, chat disconnected, where all of the different individuals are in Riley's inside out, there we go, and they're all trying to control what it is that she does. What happens if they disagree? You know, what happens if the genes disagree about what's in their best interest in terms of controlling the robot? Well, then you get intragenomic conflict, and that's something that we're going to talk about maybe a bit later. So we are merely vehicles. So yes, our flesh and blood and everything that you hold dear is actually just a hollow vessel in which our gene overlords can control their own replication. Next point. Family shares genes. Now, I am not talking about... oh, the chat was disconnected. 50 people all typed inside out at the same time. That makes a lot of sense. So, not talking about me stealing my mum's jeans because they're actually quite comfy, even though I would never buy them myself. Obviously, we know inherently, without even thinking about it, that family members share a lot of their genes, a lot of their genetic makeup, because we've got things like Jeremy Kyle, we've got DNA testing as a way of working out if you're a family member or not. Like paternity testing relies on the fact that fathers share more genes with their children than their children share with anyone else in the population other than their mother. So if you were to take the father of a daughter, so the father of a girl, and some random dude, any old dude from the population, if you compare how many of the genes they share in common over and above the population average, we'll go into that more when we talk about inclusive fitness. But I just want to say this is over and above the population average, because you might have also heard that like we share 90% of our genes with chimpanzees, and we do. So we're talking about within the bit of the genome that actually matters, within that 10% that is specific to the population, it's more similar to the father's genes are more similar to the girls than some random dudes are to the girls. And we talk about genes being I, B, D. And no, this is not gastrointestinal complaints. This is identical by descent. So if you've got these are my, pretend these are genes. They're not, but hey. Sorry, I've just realised that this is red and green. It shouldn't make too much of a difference. But if these two fall in love, then in most, so in species where there is sexual reproduction and they are diploid, just some little caveats there. If that went over your head, just think, in most of the animals you've come across, you'll end up with, oh, this is going to be fun to draw. Something looking like this. So you can see that 50% comes from the mother, 50% comes from the father. Yeah, sorry, I did not choose good colours for that. But it means that this gene here is identical to this gene here because the reason it's the same is because it's literally come from the descent, because it's come through the lineage, and not just some random member of the population happens to also have it, but for a completely different reason. Like if they spontaneously came up with the same mutation, then none of the rest of the genes would be similar, but they just happen to be. Like, I don't know, if you've got a gene for... Okay, so I've got red hair genes. It might not show up much in this light, but I do have red hair genes in my MC1R receptor. That doesn't mean that I have the same, that my red hair genes are identical by descent to anyone else with the same red hair genes. Only if you can go back through the generations and trace a common ancestry is it identical by descent. Which in itself isn't that important to deal right now, but later on it will be very important. So don't say I didn't tell you. Okay, so family shared genes, and that's at its most basic level all there is. Okay, we've got 20 minutes to cover the selfish gene and to solve the tit mystery. Okay, so just check something. Right. How am I going to do it? Okay. The selfish gene. I'm about to describe a very big topic in about 15 minutes. So we'll take a breath. Going back to our image of a helpless little gene, well, physically helpless, but fully in control, very omnipotent, no, all-powerful, even if it can't actually do anything on its own. This little gene inside this robot body wants to produce more copies of itself. As we know, the main way in which genes produce more copies of themselves is just to have more offspring. So all of the genes in me, if I were to have offspring, 50% of my genes would be in each of those kids. And so by my genes controlling me to make more offspring, to reproduce, they have been able to create more copies of themselves to replicate. And so that's why when we're thinking about natural selection, and certainly what you might have been taught in school, is that to win at natural selection, you want to produce more offspring. That's the same as the gene wants to replicate itself more often, because by and large, the way the gene replicates is to make the individual reproduce more. So those things, although there's kind of a different nuance or a different intention there, they end up with the same result. And so you can kind of consider them interchangeably. But that's not always the case. And that's not the case with the long-tailed tits that we were talking about. So if you imagine, let's go back to this. Actually, can I copy this? Let's see how good this is going to be. Ooh, no. Wanna copy Robbie the robot? Okay. See what that does. Hey, that worked pretty well. Okay, I don't know how to separate the two. Normally it would just, there we go. No, technical difficulties. the happy gene back in the robot. Okay, you get the idea. We've got 2 of these. Ah, I've got to click on the line. That's where I was going wrong. Okay. We've got 2 of these robots. And let's say that they are sisters. So we've got Robbie and we've got Bobby. They're robots. They can have whatever names they want. And so 50% of the genes in Robbie are also in Bobby, but 50% of them aren't. So 50% of them are different. Now, normally, the way that Robbie's genes will make more copies in themselves is to produce more Robbies. And so you'll get even more genes. I am not very good at drawing double helices. But can you see, if the red gene here wants to make more copies of itself, it can make Robbie have more offspring, or it can be nice to Bobby so that Bobby makes more offspring. And if Bobby makes more offspring, let's give Bobby 4 offspring, half of those will have the red gene in, roughly. So you can see how Bobby's offspring, some of them, so these are all copies of this gene up here, but so are these. These also count when we're counting the number of genes in the next generation. Remember, we're talking about, can the gene replicate and make more copies of itself? Well, these copies count just as much as these copies do. And so that means that under certain circumstances, and there's a whole load of theory about those circumstances that we will go into because that's where it gets really interesting. Under certain circumstances, it's actually better for the genes inside Robbie to be nice to, let's do a plus. How do you draw a life in computer games? You can see I don't have any computer game experience. That actually it's nicer, it's better for the red genes to not make Robbie produce more kids, but to make Bobby produce more kids, because some of Bobby's kids will also have that gene. And so this red gene here is being selfish, because all it wants to do is make more red genes in the world. That is always what the gene wants. But when we look at the robot level, when we look at the individual level, what we would see is a behaviour that looks like Robbie is giving up the chance to have some of her own offspring, and instead is giving the resources to make offspring, to make genes, to Bobby. So it looks like the individual is being really nice, is not being selfish at all, is being very selfless. But they're doing it because the genes inside them are being selfish. Hence, the selfish gene. You know, it's such a snappy phrase. Someone should turn that into the title of a book. I think it would sell remarkably well. So all the time, genes are acting in their own selfish interest. That is always the case. I hasten to say always, because it always never happens in science. But genes are always trying, they don't always succeed, but they are always trying to act in their own selfish interest. If we take away that teleology, that agency, that purpose language, what we're actually saying is genes that are successful, the genes that we see now in a population are the genes that were able to create more replicates of themselves in previous generations. Now you can see why we use the language of purpose, because it makes it so much better. So genes are always selfish. And a lot of the time, the way that genes act out their selfish desires is to control their vehicle, their individual that they are controlling, that they are inside of, to be selfish as well. But sometimes the way that a gene gets what it wants is to make the individual be selfless. And so we see kind, cooperative behaviours. And so, I think we now have everything we need to solve the mystery of the tits. So I'm just gonna bring these here. So if you remember, a whole hour ago we were talking about long-tailed tits. For those of you that have just joined, we are not talking about mammary glands. We are instead talking about long-tailed tits. And in the early 2000s, these two, that was Ben Hatchwell, this one, and Andy Russell, this one, started watching a whole bunch of tits. So these two men spent an awful lot of time, about 20 years ago, watching tits. And you can see from the smile on their faces that they very much enjoyed watching tits, and they got an awful lot of life satisfaction, and were probably government funded to watch a load of tits. This stuff just writes itself. It is quite fun. So the problem was that we had these lovely tits, and they fell in love, and they made themselves a lovely, lovely nest that was cozy and warm, and then maybe they laid some eggs. But then someone came along and ate those eggs, and they were heartbroken. And so this tit, who I am going to call, I don't want you to be, oops. I try and get fancy and it backfires on me. And so this tit, which we're gonna call Jemima tit, because she has green flourish on her tail. That's how you can recognise Jemima tit, as opposed to Jeremy tit, who has a purple flourish on his tail. So Jemima tit thinks, I could stay with Jeremy and try and have more offspring of my own, but it's getting a bit late in the year, and so I'm not sure if I'm actually going to make my own nest. And instead, she sees another pair of birds who now have a nest, and maybe they've already got little chicks. That is what chicks look like, I promise. And so now Jemima has a decision. She has to choose, is she going to have her own offspring, or is she going to help someone else? And remember that inside Jemima is a tiny little controlling gene that's actually controlling her actions. So whatever Jemima does is the product of what that gene thinks is in its own selfish best interest. So that gene is thinking, I could go on and try and make my own offspring, try and replicate that way. But if I can find a relative to help, then maybe I'll actually be able to help that way. So someone, Jean, what was her name? Someone in the comments said, well, is it a random nest that they go and help out? And the answer to that is no. Jemima looks for one of her relatives' nests to help out. And she goes over here and gives them so maybe this is instead of a purple one, this is a completely different male entirely. Goes and gives them grubs so that they can get nice and big and happy. So we've got big fat chicks that are more likely to survive. So these are the babies from that nest, and they've got a little bit of green and a little bit of blue in them because they're a product of both of their mother and their father. And so you can see how from the Jemima's green gene point of view, by helping her relatives, she's actually been able to, or from the gene's point of view, the gene has been able to make more copies of itself. So even though Jemima is doing this selfless thing and helping out at someone else's nest rather than being selfish and having her own kids, the gene that's causing that behaviour is being selfish and is ending up being able to replicate itself after all. And so what is absolutely fascinating is not my lack of command of this software, but is in fact this graph, which is from a Nature paper in 2001 called Experimental Evidence for Kin-Biased Helping in a Cooperatively Breeding Vertebrate by Andrew and Ben, Russell and Hatchwell. And so this didn't copy across the numbers, but and so they said, okay, like, we've got these individuals acting in what seems like a selfless way, but it would only be in the interest of the gene doing the controlling if they help out their relatives. Remember that if it was any other member of the population, the gene wouldn't get that benefit because they wouldn't share genes. Remember, only family members share genes. And so this gene will only benefit if it can help out relatives versus non-relatives. And so they measured who it is that helpers go and help. What is the relationship between Jemima and the nests that she helps. And they found that a whopping 80 or 90% of the time, so in 94% of cases, when a tit was given the option, do you want to help at this nest or do you want to help at that nest? So when the adult had already given up the chance of having her own offspring and was presented with a choice of a family nest or a non-family nest, 94% of the time, they would choose to help out family, relatives. Kin is relatives. Whereas a measly 6% of the time, they would help out non-relatives. And that we can explain later on as being because maybe they've mistook that individual for being a relative. You know, when you look at someone like that, those two people must be sisters or must be brothers, and they're not actually related, they just happen to look like each other. You get that in the animal kingdom as well. And in the wild, this ends up as 79% of helpers in the wild. If you look at the DNA, and yes, they literally go around doing little DNA tests on them, 79% of helpers in the wild are closely related to either one or both of the parents at the nest they're helping at. Like, how cool is this? Our genes are able to control these massive fleshy bodies in a way that helps them, even if it seems counterintuitive. But what's even cooler is we as biologists, without being able to necessarily see this happening, we can see each of the individual parts, but we can't actually see the gene necessarily doing this. We have been able to work out and solve the mystery of the tits. Like, we have been able to solve why tits that have failed in their first clutch help out another individual rather than going on to produce their own offspring, rather than making a second attempt. We have been able to use theory to predict which nests they're likely to help, and that theory has come true based, like, this is as predicted, which is wow. In living things, one of the messiest systems that science ever studies, physicists can go like, oh yes, well, we've got this rule about how a spring will extend and then come back to normal, or oh yes, we've got this theory about gravity, you know, and we can predict like how long it's going to take for this cannonball to drop to the floor if you drop it from the top of the Eiffel Tower. Like, that's physics for you. Biology is so messy. And we're talking about behaviour here, and yet we're able to use evolutionary theory to predict behaviour accurately. And this is why I find the topic of evolutionary biology absolutely, like, amazing. And it's why I spent so many years of my life studying it. I specifically looked at how evolutionary theory predicts how flies interact with their relatives versus their non-relatives, because they should be nicer to their relatives than to their non-relatives for all of the reasons we described. Or should they? Depends on what's going on. And so this is the concept of the selfish gene and the gene-centered view of evolution. And so, although in a lot of the time, the individual being selfish is what we will see, and so we can think about it like that, what's actually happening is the individual being selfish is aligning with what the gene needs to do to be selfish. But all of the time, the gene will be selfish. And that can create some amazing and fascinating behaviours that we can go into further in future weeks. I can't believe I've only run 5 minutes over time. I thought this was going to be an absolutely massive topic. Quickly looking through the comments, Adam Stevens says, how can a fly tell his relatives and non-relatives apart? Great question, Adam. That's chapter 2 of my thesis. Or not even how can they? Can they? Are they able to? And we will talk about kin recognition and kin discrimination, which is what those behaviours are later. And wait, this is awesome. People talking about their own families. So humans are really interesting. So altruism has a very strict definition in biology, which we'll go on to later. We wonder if humans are the only animals that can actually behave what we as a society generally would use the word altruism to mean, so with no benefit to the self. But yes, this explains why parents are nice to their kids. Because it is in the interest of the parent to make sure that their kid is successful at producing more kids. It's why family members tend to stick together. It's why in history, human societies, you tend to look out for your close relatives. And so, yeah, once you understand that the gene is controlling everything, it all opens up and it is fantastic. I would like to thank again the two chaps on Twitter, Roland and Claude, for drawing my lovely tits for me. And thank you to the people who have started supporting me on Patreon for next to no reward, for buying me my new beautiful shiny mic so that you could actually hear me. Next week, we're going to be looking at sexual selection, which, just like the tits today, is not nearly as risque as it makes it sound. Sexual selection is basically, why do peacocks have big tails? Why do we see differences between how males act and how females act? And when we're talking about evolution being surviving and reproducing, it's very much that reproducing part, and you get lots of really cool behaviours happening there. That's next week. Please subscribe so you find out about these. I mean, it's on every Thursday at 4 p.m. You should know by now. And as always, you can watch these videos back anytime you want. So all that remains is to say stay safe, and have a lovely week. Wash your hands and see you next week. Bye.